So in this video, I'm going to be answering the question and exploring the question, was Castro's foreign policy from 1959 to 1963 a betrayal of the promises of the revolution? Now, there's four big things in this question. First of all, Castro is in reference to Fidel Castro, the leader of Cuba from 59 up until very recently. And the revolution is in reference to the Cuban Revolution, in which Castro and his men took over the former Batista government. And the betrayal of the promises refers to what Castro said to the people in order to gain him the support in order to take over the pre-existing government and put himself in power. Now, what we first have to understand is more or less how Castro got to power and how he became the leader that he did. Now, what's really important is that Castro is a revolutionary, and he's an idealist at that. He has been wanting change in the Cuban nation for quite a while, and he became a lawyer, actually, and he went to the courts very often to try and change certain laws that he didn't like, but that never really went in his favor because Batista was not prone or privy to democratic processes, including the court. So Castro decided that if he can't get his way with the courts, that he was going to get his way with the guns. And so he decided to take up a more military revolution against the Batista government. Of course, his first couple of attempts are utter crap, and he completely fails. One, he tries to take over some military barracks in Santiago, and with like 100 other men, and almost every single one of them is captured, and a lot of them are killed. And so Fidel is left with his brother and just a couple other men to try and, take over the government again. But he doesn't give up. He is set on getting this Cuba the way he wants it. And so while he's imprisoned and then eventually sent over to Mexico, he trains and he gets more support with a couple other guys, and now his forces are up to about 80 people. And they ride over to Cuba on a boat that was made for about 30 people, and they have these awesome plans to just take over the government and shoot up all these mountains and just absolutely win it. But because they are 50 people over the capacity, the boat is 2 days too slow, and their plans turn to crap. And so they end up wandering the mountains, and they eventually get caught. And a lot of them, again, are killed, except for Fidel and his brother, who just somehow keep surviving. And so we have two, right now, under Castro's belt, two failures of revolution. However, when Castro is in the mountains, he goes back there, he sets up a public radio transmission. And through here, this is where we start to see where he starts talking about his promises of the revolution and what he's going to do. And he sends out lots and lots of propaganda against Batista and the communists. At this point in time, he is against communism, which is important for later on. But with this public radio that people can listen to, he garners some more support. And so his, previously super low troops are now up to about 200 people. And Batista is getting really irked at Castro and his constant attempts to overthrow his own government. So Batista sends in 12,000 of his own troops into the mountains of Cuba to get rid of Castro. And 12,000 to 200, that seems like pretty good odds that Batista is going to win. However, in the first couple of battles, Castro actually defeats a large portion of Batista's army, and Castro only loses like 3 to 10 people of his own men. So that is really good odds for Castro now. He is taking it over. He is fighting for what he wants. But then, there's way more troops. So they eventually capture Castro and all of his troops. But Castro, he is quite a sweet talker. He is one to talk his way into and out of situations. And so he negotiates a peace treaty, a ceasefire really, for about 3 days with Batista's army, and during this time, all of Castro's men escape Batista and get back to the mountains, and effectively the battle that almost went into Batista's favor is now completely out of it and in Castro's favor. And this entire charade here, like the Battle of Mercedes, is Castro, and he wins it by a long shot. And at this news, Batista just absolutely flails in fear and actually just gets on a plane and leaves Cuba. And so Castro, a little sweet talker, he talks to a couple high-ups in the government/military, and they basically literally just hand over Cuba to him. And so he goes from Villa Clara all the way over to Havana on this victory tour, as it may be, saying that he's the new leader and that everybody should love him. And everybody kind of does. Because during this radio and during his whole taking over the government process, he said that he was going to fix Cuba. He said that he was going to put in democratic processes, and he said that Cuba was going to be independent and it wasn't going to be at the hands of a hegemon, like the U.S. And he said that, this communism, all of this, that's bad, and the right wing of Batista, that's also bad, and I'm gonna bring up a new government that isn't bad, and everybody's gonna love it. And everybody has been falling for it because he is really good at propaganda, I'll tell you that much. So he comes into power, and this is where we can look at our question. How does Castro's foreign policy, how is it a betrayal of the promises of this revolution? Well, a first one that's really, really big, that really hurt the Cuban people, is that he didn't ever deliver at all on the democracy end. He never held elections, and he never made any attempt to have some sort of democratic process. He just literally became the dictator, and he was like, I'm the only leader. And a lot of people were hoping that it was going to be different from Batista. Batista was more or less a dictator himself. And so when Castro said, oh, no, it won't be a dictator, and then he goes and becomes a dictator, everybody is really, really irked at this. He doesn't make any attempts at helping the people here. And it's not like he didn't do anything in office. During his first 10 years, he made a lot of improvements of the Cuban society in terms of equality between black Cubans and women, and he made the literacy rate way higher, way better sanitation, a lot of stuff happened there. So it's not like he just didn't do anything. He just really didn't deliver on democracy here. But the really big issue with this foreign policy is that he said he didn't want a hegemon ruling Cuba, i.e. the U.S., and he said he wasn't going to replace it with another hegemon. But this is a complete lie, and what he says is completely opposite of what he actually does. He does deliver on one part. He does kick out the U.S. He nationalizes a lot, almost all of Cuba's farmland, even from his own people, and he nationalizes religious land. And with this, the U.S. is basically kicked out. Any stake that they had in the land of Cuba is effectively gone. And even though Castro visits the U.S. when he takes power, he adamantly refuses any economic aid because he knew that the economic aid and the military aid that the U.S. had provided Cuba is what kept Batista in power for so long. And when the U.S. had started to trickle out of Batista regime, that is when Castro was able to take over Batista because he didn't have all of that U.S. aid. And so Castro was like, I don't want this U.S. aid. It is evil. You are a hegemon. I won't have you. And so he really cuts off the U.S. And on this part, it looks like he delivers on his thing. He says, I'm not going to replace it with a hegemon. But, wait a little bit longer, and Castro's over here I'm going to be so good, and Cuba's going to be the best communist country ever. Yeah, did I mention he falls back to communism, even though he sent out propaganda that was anti-communist? Yeah, he's a wishy-washy dude. But he comes over here, and he decides to make only one thing: sugarcane. He only exports that. And it just so happens that the only person that is buying this is the Soviet Union, the USSR. And so we see Castro here with his small little export of sugarcane, and the USSR is the only person that is buying this. So if the entire economy of Cuba is set on one crop and only one person is buying that crop, that is basically Cuba is under the USSR's rule. Like, if the USSR decides to just pull out, Cuba's done for. There's no way that the economy can survive on its own, because Castro tried to do that and it failed. It didn't work at all. So here we have the USSR coming in and playing a really, really big role in Cuba, because it's basically the entire economy of Cuba. Even though Castro is effectively allies with the USSR, he still sends out anti-propaganda against the USSR and against China, who is also a possible ally. So Castro is really just kind of a bad guy. He's really, really wishy-washy and doesn't really stick with what he says, be it delivering on democracy or having an independent Cuba that doesn't have to rely on any superpower, because he does neither of those things, even though he says he was going to, and a lot of people believe that he would.